Vivian Marsh was 3 floors above her own office, cutting through the operations wing to avoid a board member she had no patience for today, when she heard a voice raised in the particular tone of a man enjoying his own cruelty. "You've had 11 months to learn basic English composition. I don't have time to keep fixing your mistakes for you." She stopped walking. Vivian had built Marsh Dynamics from a 14-person startup into a company that now occupied 9 floors of a downtown tower, and in doing so she had developed an instinct for the specific sound of someone abusing power in a room where they thought no one important was listening. She followed it now, through a set of glass doors into the administrative pool, where Preston Vale, a director 2 levels beneath her whose name she barely remembered from an org chart, stood over a desk with his arms crossed and his face flushed with the particular satisfaction of a small man finding someone smaller. Behind the desk sat a man Vivian did not recognize, though something about his stillness caught her attention before anything else did. He was not reacting to Preston's tone at all. He simply looked up, calm, unbothered, dark eyes taking in the room with a quiet thoroughness that seemed entirely out of place for a man being humiliated in front of 6 co-workers who were all suddenly very interested in their monitors. "I said I don't have time," Preston repeated, louder now, clearly frustrated that his target was not flinching the way he wanted. "Pack up your desk. I'm done carrying you." The man rose without hurry. He was tall, dressed simply, dark hair cut close, a plain gray cardigan over a white shirt, nothing about his clothing suggesting he had $2 to rub together beyond his salary. He began collecting a few items from his desk drawer with the same unhurried calm, a pen, a small notebook, nothing more. "Excuse me." Vivian's voice cut through the room, and every head turned, including Preston's, whose flush deepened into something closer to alarm. "What exactly is happening here?" "Ms. Marsh." Preston straightened his tie, an old nervous habit she recognized from every man who had ever tried to explain away bad behavior to someone above him. "This doesn't concern the executive floor. I'm handling a performance issue with one of my assistants. It concerns me the moment I can hear you shouting from the elevator bank." She crossed her arms, and something in her posture made 3 of the seated employees suddenly find urgent reasons to be elsewhere. "What performance issue?" "He makes translation errors. Costly ones. I've warned him twice." Vivian looked at the man still standing quietly beside his desk, notebook in hand, watching this exchange with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "What's your name?"
"Dan."
His voice was low, even, carrying the faintest trace of an accent that softened his consonants without obscuring a single word.
"Dan Takeda."
"Mr. Takeda, is that true? Have you made costly translation errors?" "I corrected a shipping manifest that Mr. Vale had approved without reading. The correction saved the company approximately $40,000 in customs penalties." He said it without any triumph in his voice, simply a fact laid on a table. Mr. Vale considered the correction an embarrassment. Preston's face went from flushed to nearly purple. "That's not what happened." "I have the email chain," Rin said, still with that same unbothered calm. "If you would like to review it." Vivian felt something settle in her chest, a familiar cold clarity that came whenever she realized a decision in front of her was actually simple, however messy the people involved were trying to make it look. She had not built a company this size by tolerating men who punished competence because it embarrassed their own incompetence. "Preston, you're suspended pending review, effective right now. HR will contact you this afternoon." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Mr. Takeda, put your things down. You're not going anywhere." "Ms. Marsh, this is completely inappropriate. You can't just—" "I can, and I have." She turned to Rin, who had gone very still, watching her with an intensity that she registered but did not fully understand yet, something behind his dark eyes that looked less like relief and more like careful, deliberate reassessment. "Come with me, please." He followed her without a word, and she felt the entire administrative pool exhale collectively behind them as the glass doors swung shut. Her office occupied the corner of the executive floor, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a view of the river that she rarely had time to appreciate. She gestured him toward a chair and sat across from him instead of behind her desk, a habit she had developed years ago after realizing how much information people withheld when a desk sat between them like a fortification. "Tell me what actually happened, Mr. Takeda." "Exactly what I said." He sat with an economy of movement that struck her as unusual, nothing wasted, nothing performative. "I found an error in a customs form that would have cost the company significant money and possibly triggered an audit. I corrected it. Mr. Vale had approved the original form without reviewing it properly, and my correction made that visible to people above him. He has been finding reasons to discredit me since." "How long have you worked here?" 11 months in this position." A pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "Longer in other ways." Something in the phrasing caught her attention, a strange precision to it, as if he was choosing words carefully to remain truthful while revealing as little as possible. Vivian had spent a decade in rooms full of people trying to hide things from her, investors, competitors, board members with quiet agendas, and she recognized the particular texture of careful language when she heard it. "What does that mean?" "It means I've been observing this company for longer than my employment record shows." He met her eyes directly, no evasion in it, simply a statement offered plainly. "I would prefer to explain that somewhere more private than your office, if you're willing to allow that conversation." Vivian felt the first genuine flicker of unease she had experienced in this exchange, not fear exactly, but the sharpening awareness of a woman who suddenly suspected the situation in front of her was larger than it appeared. "You're going to need to explain that right now, Mr. Takeda, or this conversation ends and I call security instead of HR." He held her gaze for a long moment, weighing something behind those calm dark eyes, and then he spoke, his voice dropping lower, losing none of its steadiness. "My name is Ren Takeda. That part is true. What is not entirely true is my role here. I did not come to Marsh Dynamics as an assistant seeking employment. I came because your company's supply chain runs through 3 ports controlled by an organization I have spent years trying to remove influence from, an organization based in Tokyo that has been quietly laundering money through several of your logistics contracts without your knowledge." Vivian sat perfectly still. "You're telling me you're some kind of investigator?" "I am telling you I lead that organization." His voice did not change register at all, delivering this the way he had delivered the customs correction, plainly, without performance. "Or rather, I lead the faction within it attempting to dismantle the very corruption using your company as one of its channels. I took this position under a different level of visibility to trace exactly how deep the infiltration into your logistics division goes, without alerting the people responsible before I had proof." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Vivian had negotiated hostile takeovers, had sat across from men who lied to her face with practiced ease, had learned to read the small tells that separated genuine information from manipulation, and everything in the way Ren Takeda held himself, still, unhurried, entirely without the need to convince her, told her this was not a manipulation. "Why should I believe any of this?"
You shouldn't yet.
He reached into his cardigan pocket and withdrew a folded paper, sliding it across the low table between them. "That is a partial transaction log from your Yokohama contracted shipping partner, cross-referenced against your official manifests. The discrepancies begin 14 months ago and total, so far, just under $2.3 million moving through accounts that do not belong to your company or your listed partners." Vivian unfolded the paper and read it with the same methodical attention she gave every financial document that crossed her desk, and the longer she read, the colder her hands became, because the numbers were precise in a way that fabricated documents rarely were, messy in the exact places real corruption always left its mess. "If this is real," she said slowly, "why bring it to me now in my office, after getting fired by my own director?" "Because Preston Vale's decision to remove me forced my hand faster than I intended." For the first time something flickered across his composure, brief and controlled but present. "I needed more time before revealing myself. His arrogance took that time away from me. I could have let him succeed in removing me and continued this work more carefully from outside. I chose instead to let you see the truth, because you defended a stranger against injustice without knowing anything about him, and I have not encountered many people in my line of work who do that without an angle of their own." Vivian set the paper down carefully. That's not an answer to why you're telling me all of this instead of disappearing. No, he agreed. It isn't. The silence that followed carried a weight she did not fully understand yet, and she found herself studying him the way she rarely studied anyone, the quiet precision of his hands, the absolute stillness of a man who had clearly spent a long time learning to be unremarkable and was choosing, in this moment, to stop. What happens now? She finally asked. Now you decide whether you want the truth about what is moving through your company, at some risk to yourself, or whether you would prefer I disappear and handle this from the shadows the way I originally planned. His eyes did not leave hers. I would understand either choice. But I would ask you not to fire Prestonvale publicly today. It would alert people who are watching this company more closely than you realize. Vivian Marsh had not survived a decade in rooms full of powerful, dangerous men by flinching from difficult decisions, and she did not flinch from this one either, though something in her chest had gone tight and unfamiliar in a way she chose, for now, not to examine.
Fine, she said.
Preston stays on paper as suspended, quietly, no announcement. You're going to walk me through every discrepancy on that list, and you're going to tell me exactly what kind of danger I've apparently invited into my own supply chain. There is one more thing you should know before I answer that. His voice dropped again, quieter, almost reluctant. The organization I'm working to dismantle knows someone inside your company has been correcting these discrepancies. They do not yet know it's me specifically, but they will look for whoever has access to the manifests I've been quietly adjusting for 11 months, and that list is short enough that it will eventually include you. The threat did not feel abstract the way threats sometimes did in boardrooms, discussed in careful hypotheticals over quarterly projections. It felt immediate, close, sitting 3 feet away from her in a plain gray cardigan, and Vivian understood, with the particular clarity that had built her entire career, that she had just stepped into something considerably larger than a personnel dispute. The next 2 weeks unfolded with a strange doubled rhythm that Vivian had never experienced before, ordinary board meetings and quarterly reviews layered over quiet late-night conversations in her office with a man who spoke 3 languages fluently, who moved through the building with the deliberate anonymity of someone who had spent years learning to be underestimated and who revealed, piece by careful piece, the true shape of what had embedded itself inside her company. The organization was called, in the documents Rin showed her, only by a designation rather than a name, a syndicate operating out of Tokyo's shipping districts that had spent 3 years quietly acquiring influence over mid-sized logistics partners across the Pacific, using legitimate businesses as laundering vehicles for money that had nothing legitimate about its origins. Marsh Dynamics had become one of those vehicles 14 months ago, before Rin ever walked through the door, chosen specifically because Vivian's rapid expansion had created exactly the kind of complex, fast-moving supply chain where irregularities could hide in plain sight. You could have told me all of this through proper channels, Vivian said one evening, nearly 10 at night, the two of them alone in her office with the city lights spread out below the windows. Law enforcement. Regulatory bodies. Why come in disguised as an assistant at all? Because the people responsible for this have reach inside several of those channels. Ren sat with the same economy he always carried, but she had learned, over these 2 weeks, to read the smaller signals beneath his stillness, the particular way his jaw tightened when he spoke about his own organization's failures. My father built the version of this world that existed before me. He believed absolute loyalty and absolute silence were the same virtue. I watched that belief allow good people to be discarded when they became inconvenient. I have spent years trying to build something different from what he left behind, and it requires proof that cannot be discredited or bought before I move against anyone. That sounds lonely, she said, before she could stop herself. Something crossed his face, brief, almost startled, as if the observation had landed somewhere he did not expect. It has been. The confession sat between them, unadorned, and Vivian found herself leaning slightly forward without deciding to, close enough to notice the faint scent that clung to him beneath the ordinary fabric softener of his cardigan, cedar, and something sharper underneath it, ink perhaps, or the particular metallic edge that lingered after time spent around old paper and older secrets. Why did you let Preston humiliate you for 11 months instead of simply removing him from your path? Because a man who draws attention to himself by punishing incompetence draws less suspicion than a man who quietly corrects it and says nothing. His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. Also, I confess, there is a particular satisfaction in watching a man like that condemn himself entirely on his own, with no help required. Vivian laughed, surprising herself, and watched something shift in his expression at the sound of it. An unguarded moment quickly folded back beneath his usual composure, though not quickly enough that she missed it entirely. 3 nights later, the danger stopped being theoretical. Vivian was leaving the building alone, later than she should have been, when a car pulled up too close to the curb outside the parking structure, and 2 men stepped out with the particular unhurried confidence of people who had done this before and expected no resistance. She recognized the posture instantly from every article she had ever half read about organized crime, the deliberate calm designed to make victims believe cooperation was their only option. "Ms. Marsh, we just need a conversation." She did not run, because running invited pursuit, and her heels would not outpace 2 men in flat-soled shoes. Instead, she did what she had trained herself to do in every hostile negotiation she had ever walked into. She stood her ground and made herself harder to move than they expected. "I'm not getting in a car with strangers," she said, keeping her voice level, already reaching for the rape whistle clipped inside her bag, a gift from her sister years ago that she had never once expected to use. "You have exactly 1 chance to leave before I make this very loud." The larger of the 2 men reached for her arm, and Vivian twisted away hard enough to break his grip, using momentum to slam her elbow back into his ribs with a force that surprised even her, adrenaline turning her ordinary strength into something sharper. The whistle shrieked into the night air a half-second later, piercing and relentless, and the second man swore and lunged for her bag instead of her, trying to silence the sound rather than complete whatever mission they had arrived for. Rin arrived before either of them had recovered their composure, moving through the parking structure with a speed and precision that made the entire scene shift instantly. What happened next lasted less than a minute, brutal and economical, his movements carrying none of the wasted motion of a man improvising, only the quiet certainty of someone who had done violence before and found no pleasure in it beyond its necessity. Both men were on the ground, disarmed, one of them groaning against the concrete, before Vivian had fully processed what she was watching. Rin turned to her immediately, his usual stillness cracked wide open, hands hovering near her shoulders without quite touching, checking her over with an intensity that had nothing calculated about it at all. Vivian, her first name, not her title, low and rough in a way she had not heard from him before. "Are you hurt?"
No.
Her voice shook slightly despite her best effort to steady it.
I've fine.
"I hit him first, actually." Something that was almost a laugh, dark and startled, escaped him. "So, I noticed. You didn't have to intervene. I had it handled." "I know." He said it simply, without argument, though his hands had not moved away from her shoulders, and something in his eyes as he looked at her carried a weight she recognized now, had been recognizing for days without naming it. "That is precisely the problem, Vivian. I keep discovering you do not need saving, and I keep wanting to be here anyway." The 2 men were gone by the time building security arrived, taken by 2 others who emerged briefly from a second car and vanished into the city with a kind of efficiency that told her exactly what organization they answered to, though not which side of it. Rin gave her a look that told her not to ask further questions tonight, and for once, she didn't. She went home that night with Rin following at a careful distance in a second car, and though nothing more happened between them, she lay awake replaying the particular way he had said her name. Once, in the middle of danger, like it was something he had been holding back for longer than 2 weeks. The days after the parking garage incident moved faster than anything before them. Rin revealed that the men who approached her had been sent not by the larger syndicate directly, but by a lieutenant named Hoshino, a man who had once served under Ren's father and now operated with none of the caution the old order had demanded, believing violence against outsiders carried no consequence as long as it stayed quiet. "He's testing whether I'll protect you," Rin said, standing in her office with a tension in his shoulders she had not seen from him before. "If I do, it confirms what he already suspects, that I have a weakness he can use. If I don't, you remain a target regardless." Then don't ask me to hide, Vivian said. I've spent my career refusing to disappear because someone more powerful found me inconvenient. I'm not starting now. You're not simply inconvenient to Hoshino. You're a lever. His jaw tightened. He would use you to control me if he could. That is not a hypothetical risk. That is the entire function you now serve in his calculations. Then let's change his calculations. She crossed her arms, holding his gaze steadily. Give me something real to do instead of asking me to stay safely out of the way. I built this company by finding leverage other people missed. Let me use that. Something moved behind his eyes, reluctant admiration warring with clear apprehension. What do you have in mind? What she had in mind, over the following days, was methodical and precise in a way that surprised even Ren, who had assumed, incorrectly, that her usefulness would end where his world's particular violence began. Vivian used her own network, quiet conversations with contacts across 3 continents built over a decade of legitimate business relationships, to trace which of her shipping partners had recently altered their internal auditing procedures in ways that matched the pattern of concealment Ren had already identified. She built, essentially, a parallel financial map to the one he had constructed alone for years, except hers moved through channels his organization's suspicion had always kept him from accessing directly: legitimate banking relationships, insurance underwriters, freight insurance claims that told their own quiet story. You found in 6 days what it took me 11 months to assemble, Ren said, reviewing the documentation she had built, something unguarded in his voice that she had rarely heard from him. You were working from inside a world that watches you constantly. I was working from inside a world that trusts me completely. She met his eyes. We were always going to move faster together than either of us could alone. The confession that followed did not arrive as a declaration. It arrived, exactly as she had come to expect from him, as something spoken plainly, without ornament, offered because it was true rather than because it was beautiful. I told myself, when I took this position, that I would remain invisible until the work was finished. He was standing close to her desk, close enough that she could see the fine grain of exhaustion beneath his composure, weeks of careful restraint finally giving way. I have failed at that completely. I see you before I see the danger, in any room now. That was never supposed to happen. Is that a complaint? She asked, though her voice had gone softer than she intended.
No.
His hand found hers on the desk, deliberate, unhurried. It is the only part of the last month I do not regret. She did not pull away. The distance between them, carefully maintained through weeks of danger and disguise and careful revelation, finally collapsed, and when he kissed her it carried the same quality as everything else about him, deliberate, unhurried, entirely without pretense, a decision made rather than an impulse followed. They did not have long to sit inside that moment before Hoshino made his final move. He came not for Vivian directly, but for the company itself, triggering a coordinated freeze on 3 of Marsh Dynamics' largest shipping accounts through corrupted banking contacts, a move designed to cripple her business publicly and force Ren to expose himself in her defense, drawing him into the open where the older, more brutal elements of the organization could finally move against him without the protection of his careful anonymity. Vivian learned about the frozen accounts at 6 a.m, her phone lighting up with alerts from 3 different banking relationships simultaneously, and she understood immediately, with the cold clarity of a woman who had built an empire and now watched it targeted with precision, exactly what was happening. This is a trap for you, she said to Ren over the phone, already dressing, already moving. He wants you to expose yourself defending the company. That's the actual target. I know. His voice was tight, controlled in the particular way she had learned meant he was holding something back by force of will. Vivian, I need you to let me handle this alone.
No.
She said it without hesitation, pulling her jacket on, already calling her car. You've spent a month watching me refuse to be a passive character in my own story. I'm not starting now, and I'm not asking your permission. What followed was not the version of the story where a woman waits safely while a dangerous man resolves danger on her behalf. Vivian arrived at her own headquarters within the hour, and rather than retreating to the safety of her office, she called an emergency session with her legal and financial teams, exposing the corrupted banking contacts publicly through her own regulatory relationships before Hoshino's people could complete whatever damage they intended. Freezing the freeze itself through pressure applied from legitimate channels that had no idea they were being used as a weapon in someone else's war. It was, in its own way, more devastating to Hoshino's plan than any act of violence could have been, because it stripped his leverage away entirely without giving him the confrontation he wanted, without pulling Ren into the open the way he had calculated. By the time Ren's own people moved on Hoshino's operation that evening, the man had already lost the one advantage he believed he held, and what should have been a careful, drawn-out confrontation collapsed instead into something fast and final, resolved before it had the chance to become the kind of war either side wanted. Vivian was in her office, still working through the regulatory aftermath of the morning, when Ren finally returned later that night, moving slower than she had ever seen him move, tension carved into every line of him that had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of a man who had just finished dismantling something his own father had built. "It's finished," he said, standing in her doorway. Hoshino's faction inside the organization no longer exists in any form that matters. The accounts will be released within the week. "What did it cost you?" she asked, because she had learned enough about his world to know nothing and it came free. "A version of my father's legacy that I had spent years trying not to fully destroy." His jaw tightened. "I told myself I was only removing corruption. Today I removed the last people who remembered him as anything other than a cautionary tale. There is no version of tonight that leaves that untouched." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it completely, understanding now the particular weight he carried. A man who measured every action against a legacy he had never asked for and had spent his entire life trying to redeem rather than escape. "Don't be." He crossed the room and took her hand, the same deliberate gesture as before, though something in it now carried a permanence that had not been there weeks ago. "I have spent years building distance between myself and anyone who could be used against me. You walked through that distance without trying, because you refused to be careful around danger the way everyone else in my life has learned to be." "I was careful," she said honestly. "I was terrified more than once." "Good." His mouth curved into something that finally reached his eyes fully, the first unguarded smile she had seen from him since the day she had defended a silent stranger in a room full of people too afraid to speak up for him. "Fear without foolishness is wisdom. You have managed that from the beginning, which is rarer than you know." "Is that your version of a declaration?" "I don't make declarations, Vivian. I make decisions." He lifted her hand, pressing his mouth to her knuckles with a formality that should have felt performative and instead felt like the truest gesture he had offered her yet. "I have decided this company and the woman running it are no longer separate from the rest of my life. I would like to know if you have decided the same." She thought about the moment 3 weeks ago when she had walked into an administrative pool to defend a stranger she assumed was simply an underpaid assistant, and how that single decision, made without calculation, had unraveled into the most dangerous and honest month of her life. "I decided the night I broke a man's grip and blew a whistle in a parking garage instead of getting in that car," she said. "I don't walk away from things I've already decided to keep." He laughed then, low and real, a sound she suspected very few people had ever been given the privilege of hearing from him, and the office around them, glass and steel and the quiet hum of a company that had nearly been destroyed and instead had simply grown sharper, felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely safe. Vivian kept running Marsh Dynamics exactly as she always had, methodical, unflinching, unwilling to be impressed by power that had not earned her respect first. Preston Vale did not return from his suspension, and the position he left behind was filled within the month by someone considerably less arrogant. Ren remained, no longer disguised, no longer hidden, a man the company now understood in general terms as a security consultant with unusually deep international connections, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true. What she gained, in the end, was a partner who said her name like it carried weight, who had learned, against every instinct a lifetime of caution had built into him, that the woman standing beside him required no protection so much as she required to be trusted completely, and understood now, finally, that the two things had never actually been the same at all.